Oh, before I forget, man, I was hoping you could give me a hand with something. The cashier, a young guy who couldn't have been more than in his late teens or early 20s, glanced up from loading a plastic bag with a couple sodas, a pack of chips, and some Lucky Strikes. For a second, he froze, caught mid-motion. After a brief pause, he finally responded. Yeah, what's up, man? I let out a small sigh of relief. Part of me had worried I might get a snarky dismissal instead. Feeling reassured, I reached for my back pocket. So, I got myself a little lost out here. Took a late-night drive and somehow ended up going in circles on these back roads. I pulled out a folded map and spread it across the counter so we could both look at it. Think you could help me figure out where we are? And more importantly, how I can get back to the main highway? There was a long silence again before the kid started to laugh, softly at first, but then louder. Dude, a paper map? Seriously? What is this, 1993? He managed to say between chuckles. I sighed again, this time more heavily. I had a feeling someone his age might react like this, and I wasn't wrong. Couldn't say I didn't see it coming. He wiped at his eyes, still grinning. For real, man, don't you have GPS in your car? Without missing a beat, I pointed over my shoulder to the old beige sedan parked outside by the pumps. Not in a 1979 Honda Accord, I replied. He glanced at the car through the glass door, clearly wanting to throw in another joke, probably something about upgrading my car, but he wisely held back. Instead, still smirking to himself, he leaned over the map. A few seconds later, he snapped his fingers. Ha! I still got it! He jabbed his finger down near the center of the map and looked up at me. We're about here, roughly 6 or 7 miles from Placer. I leaned over to take a closer look as he lifted his finger. Here? He nodded, and I circled the spot with a pen from my pocket before studying the map a bit more. Okay, so it looks like there's a few different roads I could take to get back to Interstate 5, right? The kid nodded again, his expression turning more bored by the second. Yeah, sure, he said flatly, then placed my bagged items on top of the map. That'll be $14.50 for the stuff, and $28.50 for the gas. I pulled out my wallet, took out 3 20s, and handed them over. The register chimed as the drawer popped open, and he returned my change. After tucking the money and my wallet back into my pocket, I grabbed the bag and folded the map up again. Thanks for the help, I said, turning to leave. Yeah, no problem, he mumbled as I walked toward the door. A bell attached to the handle jingled as I pushed it open and stepped outside, letting the door swing shut behind me. The hum of refrigerators and buzzing fluorescent lights inside the store was quickly replaced by the sounds of the summer night outside. Crickets chirped loudly in the grass, blending with the buzzing of the lights above the pumps. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, followed by the distinctive call of an elk. I took a deep breath of the fresh night air before heading down the steps toward my car. Pulling open the driver's door, I took one last look around before dropping into the seat. So, did you figure out where we are? Asked a voice from the passenger side. For a split second, confusion and panic swept over me as I spun in my seat, only to be hit with a wave of embarrassment as I remembered. My friend let out a hearty laugh. Dude, were you in there so long that you forgot I was waiting out here for you? Not wanting to admit I had, in fact, forgotten, I shook my head. Nah, man, it was just dealing with that kid inside. He was kind of a pain. He nodded sympathetically. Craig was one of my closest friends. Since we first met, we clicked instantly and had stuck together ever since. One of our favorite things to do was take late-night drives with no destination, just cruising around while the radio played. Sometimes sharing a joint one of us had picked up. This was the first time, though, that we'd actually gotten lost. I reached into the bag, pulled out the bottle of Mr. Pibb, and handed it to him. Here, I said plainly, before grabbing the Lucky Strikes and tossing the rest of the bag into the back seat. Taking the key from my pocket, I slid it into the ignition and gave it a turn. The car's buzzer sounded as the dash lights flickered on, and soon after, the inline-4 engine rumbled to life with its familiar hum. I tore open the cigarette pack, pulling one out and slipping it between my lips before reaching to push in the car's cigarette lighter. As I did, I shot a casual glance back toward the store and froze. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the kid from the store was standing at the door, staring straight at us. What in the actual hell? Craig noticed my sudden stillness and followed my gaze, turning to look for himself. "Dude, what's that guy's problem?" he muttered, clearly as weirded out as I was. I shook my head, just as the lighter popped back out. I pressed the glowing coil to the cigarette's tip until it caught, then slid the lighter back into place. After exhaling a plume of smoke, I finally responded, still unsettled. "I have no idea, but yeah, that's definitely creepy." I glanced back at the kid once more. He hadn't blinked or moved, just kept staring at us through the glass with that unnerving intensity. "Let's get out of here," Craig said, mirroring the exact thought running through my head. I put the car into first gear and gently eased off the clutch, letting the car roll forward. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Craig flip the bird at the kid as we slipped out from under the gas station lights and into the dark. "Prick," he mumbled under his breath. I turned the car left, heading back the way we'd come. "Well, at least I did figure out where we are," I said, pulling the map from my pocket and handing it to Craig. I heard him fumble for a second, then a small flashlight clicked on as he studied the map. "Dude, how did we end up almost all the way east to Placer?" he asked, his voice laced with surprise. "Guess we've been driving longer than usual," I replied, rolling down my window to flick the ashes from my cigarette. I glanced at the dashboard clock, 2:45 a.m. I sighed. Great. Vanessa's probably worrying herself sick by now. She's always been nervous about my late-night drives, especially since we started dating 5 years ago. No matter how much I reassured her, she worried I'd get into an accident, either collide with another car, wrap my Honda around a tree, or hit some wild animal on these deserted roads. Most times I'd come home to find her sitting up, waiting for me, concern etched in those beautiful sapphire eyes of hers. I bit my lip, debating. "Hey, do you think I should text Vanessa and let her know we're all right?" I asked Craig. He snorted. "Honestly, bro, number, I know she loves you to death and it's cool that she cares, but she's gotta chill. You know what you're doing, and besides, you two could use some space. It's not healthy spending every waking second together." I flicked the remainder of the cigarette out the window and laughed. "That's called being in love, man. You should try it sometime." Craig chuckled. "Nah, I'll pass. I like being single too much." Shaking my head, I turned my focus back to the road ahead. The headlights illuminated the narrow, winding path in front of us, while the trees crowded the road, casting long shadows that almost blotted out the moonlight. The unease I'd felt earlier began creeping back. We hadn't passed another car in at least 2 hours. "Well, Derek, what did you expect? You drove into the middle of nowhere. Might as well head all the way to Idaho next time." I shook off the thought and reached into the center console, fumbling for a mixtape. A little music would settle my nerves. I slid the tape into the cassette player and hit play. A second later, the heavy bass and synths of Dance with the Deads. That house blasted through the speakers. Craig whooped in excitement. "Yes! This is exactly the kind of music we need for a drive like this." He rolled down his window and stuck his head out, letting out a loud whoop into the night. I couldn't help but grin at his antics. Friggin' goofball. The shift in mood helped calm my nerves, and I found myself sinking back into the seat, letting the tension drift away on the breeze streaming through the window. For a while, everything felt right. The road stretching out in front of us, fading into the blackness behind, the music blasting through the speakers, and the steady hum of the engine in the background. I glanced at the clock again. It was 5 minutes to 3. We should be hitting the highway soon. That thought relaxed me even more. I reached into the back seat, barely catching the edge of the bag with my fingertips. Pulling it forward, I grabbed my bottle of soda and, with one hand on the wheel, twisted the cap open. I took a quick swig, tipping my head back for just a second. When I looked back at the road, everything changed in an instant. A figure had stepped right out into the road. "Fucking hell!" I yelled, slamming my feet onto the brake and clutch. The tires screeched as the rear wheels locked up, and the deafening sound of rubber burning against asphalt filled the car. My heart dropped as the back end of the car started sliding out. Oh, hell no, no! The world around me became a blur of dark shapes and colors, and I braced for the inevitable crash. into a tree, into the ditch, or worse. But miraculously, the car came to a screeching halt, the suspension groaning in protest. We had spun a full 180 degrees and were now facing the way we had come. I stared at the black tire marks on the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel like a vice. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breaths were coming in shallow, shaky bursts. For a moment, everything was completely still. Then Craig reached over and snapped the music off. "Dude, what the fuck?" he yelled, his face as pale as I imagined mine was. I didn't answer him. Instead, I yanked the handbrake up, unbuckled my seatbelt, and practically kicked open the door. My legs felt like jelly as I stumbled out onto the road, moving to the front of the car and stepping between the beams of the headlights. I scanned the road ahead, then the trees on either side. Nothing. What the hell? I turned and looked behind the car, over its roof. The taillights cast a dim red glow onto the road, but beyond that, there was nothing but blackness. I turned again, staring into the dense forest that bordered the road. Not a single branch moved, and aside from the low hum of the idling engine, there wasn't a sound. I shook my head. Did I imagine it? I know someone was there. The sound of the passenger door opening pulled me out of my thoughts. Craig stepped out, leaving his door hanging open, and quickly walked over to me. "You've got about 20 seconds to explain what the hell just happened before I lose it." "Man," he demanded, clearly rattled. I struggled to find my voice, but finally managed to get the words out. Someone stepped out of the woods and onto the road. I'm not crazy, dude. It looked like a woman. I thought I was gonna hit her. I realized I'd been holding my breath and exhaled shakily, trying to steady myself. Craig stared at me, clearly confused. "You serious?" he asked, his brow furrowed. I nodded. He pulled out the flashlight from earlier and switched it on, sweeping the beam across the tree line on one side of the road, then the other. After a few passes, he turned back to me, his expression uncertain. "Well, whoever it was, they're not here anymore," he said. Then, almost to himself, he muttered, "But why would a woman be out here in the middle of nowhere?" "I don't know, man. It's Josephine County. There's plenty of decent people out here, but also some real weirdos," I replied, hearing him snort in agreement. But my mind wasn't on the conversation anymore. Something had shifted. A new feeling had crept in, something heavy and ominous. It hit me with the force of a freight train. The unmistakable sensation of eyes staring right into the back of my head. I spun around, looking back toward the car. Nothing. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. Then it hit me again, this time from the direction I'd been facing earlier. I turned slowly, eyes wide, scanning the darkness beyond the trees. Realization dawned, and a shiver ran up my spine, dread settling deep in my gut. "Oh, shit," I whispered. Craig caught the look on my face. "What? What is it?" he asked, his voice rising with concern. "What?" he repeated more urgently this time. I finally looked at him, my voice weak and trembling. "Let's get back in the car. Right now." Thankfully, Craig didn't argue. He was already moving for the passenger door, and I followed suit. The feeling of being watched growing more intense, like something or someone was closing in from the woods. Oh, hell no. Panic hit, and I broke into a run, then a full sprint for the last 10 feet, fumbling with the door handle before launching myself into the driver's seat. I slammed the door behind me and immediately jammed down the door lock, glancing over to see Craig doing the same. In the darkness, I couldn't see his face, but his voice betrayed his fear. "What the hell was that, man?" The tone in his voice told me he had felt it too, if only for a moment, that same oppressive fear that had gripped me. "You ever see those videos of people driving on empty roads at night and someone steps out to stop them?" I asked. There was a sharp intake of breath from his side of the car. "And then a bunch of people jump out of the woods to ambush them." "Oh, hell no," he finished. "Exactly. Time to get the hell out of here." I released the parking brake, fastened my seatbelt, and jammed the car into first gear. The tires chirped as I hit the gas, and we sped away, the car lurching forward as if it too was eager to escape. As we accelerated, The eerie feeling of being watched quickly faded, like a bad dream slipping away upon waking. I let out a long breath, feeling the tension start to drain from my body. We drove in silence for a few more minutes before I finally spoke. "I think we're in the clear now." Craig let out a relieved chuckle. "Thank fuck for that." I nodded, reaching down for the soda that had wedged itself by the parking brake. I unscrewed the cap, took a long swig, and felt the cool liquid soothe my throat. Recapping it, I tossed it back into the rear seat and let out a soft laugh. Not to sound like a buzzkill, but I think I might take a break from these late-night drives for a while. This whole thing got under my skin too much. For a few seconds, Craig didn't say anything, but then he spoke, his voice quieter. "As much as that sucks, bro, I get it. No problem at all." There was a tinge of sadness in his tone, maybe disappointment, and something else I couldn't quite place. But before I could think about it too much, I heard him shift in his seat. "Hey, Jake?" he asked, a slight edge of concern creeping into his voice. "Yeah?" He took a breath. "Shouldn't we be near the highway by now? Or at least see some headlights from other cars?" His question hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't been fully paying attention, too focused on the next stretch of road lit by the headlights. But now that he mentioned it, where was the highway? I jerked my head forward, straining to see beyond the beams. What the hell? Craig was right. By now we should have seen the distant glow of cars passing on the highway, especially since I distinctly remembered glancing at my side mirror when we'd turned onto this road from the main stretch. Back then, I'd seen the faint glimmers of white and red from vehicles zipping by in both directions. But now, nothing. All that lay ahead was darkness and the endless woods on either side of the road. I lifted my foot off the gas, letting the car slow a little as my brain tried to make sense of it. Craig's gotta be mistaken, I thought. Hell, I must be mistaken. Maybe we just haven't gotten close enough to the highway yet. These old roads tend to be longer than they seem. Feeling slightly reassured, I voiced my thoughts to Craig. He nodded, but I could tell by the look on his face that he wasn't totally convinced. And honestly, neither was I. It felt like seeing that woman on the road had thrown me off more than I wanted to admit. Determined to shake the unease, I pressed my foot back down on the gas, shifting into fourth gear as the speedometer ticked up to 55. For the next few minutes, neither of us said a word, the silence between us as thick as the darkness outside. Then, suddenly, Craig let out a startled cry. "There!" A light exclamation mark. My heart surged with hope, and I leaned forward, expecting to see the glow of the highway up ahead. But instead, all I saw was a lone streetlight standing sentinel by the side of the road. Under its dim, flickering light stood a weathered, bullet-riddled sign. Confused, I slowed the car as we approached, squinting to read the faded letters. Golden. 2 miles. "The fuck?" Craig whispered, reading the sign aloud. The streetlight illuminated the interior of the car for a brief moment, revealing the same confused, worried expression that was no doubt etched onto my face. How the hell did we end up near Golden? Craig didn't argue, thankfully. He was already moving for the open passenger door, and I matched his pace as the feeling of being watched grew more intense, like someone or something was closing in from the woods. My heart pounded as I broke into a run, then sprinted the last few feet, tearing open the door and practically launching myself into the driver's seat. I slammed the door shut and jammed down the lock, seeing Craig do the same beside me. Even though I couldn't see his face in the dark, his voice gave it away. "What the hell was that, man?" His tone wavered, filled with the same fear I felt. I knew he'd sensed it too. "You remember those videos where people drive on empty roads at night and someone steps out to stop them?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. Craig let out a sharp breath, picking up my train of thought. And then a bunch of people jump out of the woods to ambush them. Oh, hell no. Exactly. Time to get the hell out of here. I yanked the parking brake off, pulled my seatbelt on, and slammed the car into first gear. The tires squealed as I hit the gas, and we took off, the oppressive feeling of being watched evaporating as we sped down the road. I let out a shaky sigh of relief. For a few minutes, silence filled the car, broken only by the engine's hum and the soft rush of the wind. "I think we're in the clear now," I finally said. Craig let out a short laugh. "Thank fuck for that." He reached over and gave my shoulder a quick pat. "Seriously, man, I'm lucky to have you as a friend. Thanks." I nodded, though I doubted he could see it. "No problem, man." Glancing at the clock, I saw it was still 3 a.m. Only 5 minutes had passed, but it felt like 30. Stress has a way of stretching time. For a while, we drove in silence, nothing but the darkness and the road ahead. Then, out of nowhere, a light appeared in the distance. "Ha! There we go!" I exclaimed, expecting to see the highway sign any second now. But the familiar chill ran up my spine as the sign for Golden flew by once again. What the... My grip tightened on the steering wheel as my mind scrambled to process it. Craig didn't say anything, but I felt him stiffen in the seat beside me. The streetlight disappeared behind us, and a creeping sense of unease settled over the car, thicker than before. It was the same sensation I'd felt when we first got out of the car, the sensation of being watched. I glanced at the dark trees whipping by, but saw no one. The turnoff for the ghost town appeared once more, and this time, Craig spoke up. "Derek, pull over. Please." His voice was shaking. I didn't want to stop, but the fear in his voice compelled me. I slowed the car, pulling over just before the turnoff. Craig ripped off his seatbelt and threw the door open, stepping out. I watched as he walked to the front of the car, standing there in the headlights. His shoulders were shaking slightly. I unbuckled my seatbelt and was about to follow when I glanced at the clock, and froze. It still showed 3 a.m. The hands hadn't moved at all. A cold wave of shock hit me, and I tapped the clock with my finger, hoping it was stuck, but it refused to move. "What the actual fuck is going on?" I whispered under my breath, my voice shaky. I fumbled for my phone and clicked it on. Like the clock, it showed 3 a.m. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, gnawing at the back of my mind as I stared at Craig standing in the headlights. I quickly typed out a message to Vanessa. "Hey, baby girl, just wanted to let you know that Craig and I are okay. We're trying to get back to the highway but got a little turned around. If I don't text you again in 15 minutes, text me back, okay? Love you." Sliding the phone back into my pocket, I pushed open the door and stepped out, walking around the front of the car to where Craig was standing. "Hey, you all right?" I asked softly. He didn't respond, but at least he had stopped shaking. I asked again, louder this time. Still no answer. As I called his name a third time, the dread clawing at me grew stronger, a potent mix of fear and confusion. Something wasn't right. "Craig, you're creeping me the fuck out. Please say something." My voice trembled as I stared at him. Finally, he turned to look at me, his face illuminated faintly by the car's headlights. He was pale, and his eyes looked haunted. Then he raised a shaky hand and pointed ahead, uttering a single word. "Look." My stomach churned as I followed his gaze. "Look." My eyes followed Craig's gesture, and it felt like someone had dumped a bucket of ice water over my head. The cigarette slipped from my lips, falling to the ground unnoticed. Standing about 50 feet away, just inside the tree line, was the figure. The same woman who had stepped into the road earlier, nearly causing me to wreck. Oh, fuck me sideways. I swallowed hard, my voice shaky. We should get back in the car, Craig." Craig nodded immediately, his own voice faltering. "I think you might be right." Not daring to take our eyes off the figure, we slowly backed up until we reached our doors, climbing inside in one quick motion. I didn't even bother with the seatbelt. I just jammed the car into first gear and floored it. The tires spun, kicking gravel and dirt behind us, and the car shot forward down the road. This time, I didn't ease up on the gas. My foot stayed firmly pressed down, the engine roaring as I shifted from third to fourth. The speedometer climbed to 60, but the feeling of being watched clung to us, growing stronger with every second. I silently prayed to see something familiar, a turnoff, a house, even a broken-down payphone. Anything to anchor us in reality. Then, my heart stopped. A light appeared up ahead, the exact same light we'd passed before, with the sign for golden beneath it. I flicked a glance at the clock, and terror surged through me. It still hadn't moved. "This isn't good, bro," Craig muttered from the passenger seat, his voice tense. I didn't answer, but I agreed wholeheartedly. I kept my foot to the floor, pushing the car to 80. The turnoff loomed again, and what I saw made me want to scream. The woman was closer to the road, and she wasn't alone anymore. Behind her, shadowy figures stood in the trees, dozens of them, their outlines blurry in the darkness. They were all facing the road, watching us. Then they vanished into the rearview mirror as we sped by. "Fuck," I breathed as we passed the streetlight again. This time, the mass of figures was even closer. The woman stood at the front, her nightgown soaked with blood, a river of red running down its front. It looked ancient, like it had been worn for decades. Craig's voice broke through my growing fear. "What the hell do we do?" he asked, his words steady, but laced with the same terror gnawing at me. I shook my head, my throat dry. "I don't know, man." The light appeared again in the distance. My phone vibrated in my pocket, nearly making me slam on the brakes in surprise. Fumbling, I pulled it out, feeling Craig's eyes on me. I texted Vanessa earlier, told her to reply in a few minutes. Now, I think I'm gonna tell her to call the cops or something. Craig didn't reply, his focus fixed on the approaching light. My eyes darted between the road and the phone screen, fingers trembling as I unlocked it. I ignored the turnoff as we flew past, refusing to look at the figures. Now so close to the road I could feel their presence pressing in on me. I tapped the messenger icon and opened Vanessa's text. For a moment, I felt a small surge of relief, that tiny slice of normalcy, a lifeline in this nightmare. Then I froze, my eyes glued to the single sentence she had sent. "What the fuck?" I whispered. Craig noticed my reaction immediately. "What? What did she say?" I didn't respond. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it, but I hit a mental wall. The more I tried to understand, the more confused I became, and the unease inside me morphed into a deep, consuming fear, different from the terror of the figures outside. This felt worse, more personal. The speedometer now read 90. Craig's voice cut through the fog of my thoughts. "Can I ask you something, man?" Ice filled my veins. His voice, it had changed. Gone was the fear, the urgency. Instead, it sounded flat. No, not flat. Wrong. The way he spoke, it almost felt like he was smiling. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I forced myself to respond, my voice dry and shaky. "What?" Craig turned to me as the streetlight neared. "Are you scared?" Something about the question made me glance at him, just as the light flickered over us. For a brief second, the car's interior was bathed in light, and my eyes locked with his. It wasn't Craig staring back at me. His face was twisted, a grotesque grin stretched wide, eyes cold and empty. The light flashed by, and for just a second, I caught the woman standing right next to the road, fully illuminated in the headlights. I saw her face clearly, and it was like nothing I could have prepared for. A guttural scream tore from my throat, my hands scrambling for the door handle as the car veered violently to the right. My vision blurred, but I saw a tree looming ahead, hurtling toward the windshield. Instinct took over. Without thinking, I threw the door open and jumped. The ground rushed up to meet me. Then, darkness. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, bandages wrapped around my head and one arm held in a sling. My chest burned with every shallow breath. The first thing I saw was Vanessa. She burst into tears the moment our eyes met and leaned over to hug me gently. Her relief was palpable, though my own mind was still reeling. Moments later, the doctor entered. He explained that I was lucky. Unbelievably lucky, considering I'd thrown myself out of a moving car. I had a gash on my head that needed staples, broken ribs, and a shattered arm, but that was it. Shocking, really, given the speed at which you dove from the car, he remarked, raising an eyebrow as if he couldn't quite believe it himself. Then he told me the police wanted to ask me some questions. 2 officers entered the room shortly after, their expressions serious. They asked me to recount everything that had happened, and I did. Well, almost everything. I left out the most unbelievable parts. Despite that, They seemed to take my account seriously, exchanging glances as one of them spoke up. "We've had similar reports," he said carefully, "though nothing quite like yours." Then they told me how I'd been found. A father and son, who owned a gas station nearby, had been driving when they came across my wrecked Honda, wrapped around a tree. Then they found me lying unconscious in the grassy ditch. The officers didn't give specifics, but I had a strong suspicion who the son was. I could guess from our earlier encounter at the gas station. That night was 3 months ago. Since then, I've been at home, recovering, physically at least. Mentally, though, it's been a struggle. I try not to think too much about that night, afraid I might lose my grip on reality if I dwell on it for too long. Especially after the police told me there had been no sign of anyone else at the crash site. The only thing they'd found was the passenger door hanging open. But everything came rushing back when I received an email from an unknown address. The message was from the kid at the gas station. He said he needed to tell me things his father had been seeing for years, but had never fully believed. Not until that night, when the kid saw something outside the gas station door and frantically called his dad. As I sit here, typing this out, my hands begin to shake uncontrollably. The memories flood back, no matter how hard I've tried to bury them. I can still see the woman's face, the desperate horror etched into her expression as she waved frantically at me in the headlights. A ghost, warning me, trying to make me understand. The same fear, I imagine, was written on the faces of the others, those shadowy figures standing behind her. And I remember Craig, or whatever was pretending to be Craig. The split second the light illuminated his face, his smile stretched unnaturally wide, filled with sharp, shark-like teeth, his eyes black and soulless. The same terrifying smile the kid at the gas station described, the one he saw flash at him as I pulled away that night. But what haunts me the most, what will keep me from ever taking another late-night drive again, are the 3 words Vanessa sent me in her text. The words that sent my mind spiraling, trying desperately to remember my friendship with the person sitting beside me that night, and failing. Horror overwhelmed me as I realized I couldn't recall a single memory of him. The text that will be burned into my mind forever. "Darling, who's Craig?"